Hello, everyone. Well, it's not Britain's Hangout Hour, but it is a discussion here today.
And it's an hour.
Yeah. Hopefully, we'll make it.
Is
Um,
it actually we are recording now? I don't see any recording
oh no,
sign.
I'm recording off of OBS, so it's
Oh,
probably not
okay,
going to be
cool.
shown on. Um, but I'm here with two very well-known figures in the fantasy booktube sphere. I'm here with Dr. Philip Chase, Dr. Fantasy as he's called. If you'd like to introduce yourself real quick, you can do that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm Philip Chase. I have a YouTube channel all about fantasy, and I'm also a published author now, self-published author of the Idan trilogy. So that's me.
And we are also joined by Raf. So Raf, do the thing.
Well, cheers. I'm Raf. I'm an angry old white man on the internet, mostly.
All right, yeah, yeah.
Covers it all.
I was gonna say, you have to have a couple of. Well, I thought since you two tend to take the fantasy genre very seriously, I thought it would be interesting to discuss. Well, basically, the question here today is fantasy literature. The spoiler answer is yes, I think it is. But um, I wonder, there's still a lot of double standards about the genre, and kind of why that's the case. I thought we discussed that today. So yeah, here we are.
Cool.
So I guess the first question I have here that I wanted to discuss today is what do you think draws people to the fantasy genre? I'll let Philip go first here.
Age before
Okay.
beauty.
Yes, exactly. Yes. I am actually, the real old man here is me. But yeah, in terms of why do people love fantasy, I think you could list a long array of reasons. There's simple entertainment, which is fine. I think that's great. A lot of storytelling exists just to entertain. But I also think that fantasy, in terms of what literature can do, has some distinct advantages, since it is I think, one of the forms of literature, one of the genres, as it were, that is, I think, most conducive to the use of imagination. Fantasy encourages creative thought, and I think that is liberating for a lot of people, and that it allows people through what some people call psychic distance to work out things that are they may be struggling with in the real world, but in an imagined setting, which can make that easier. It can help that process along in some important ways. So it has a very much like myth, I believe that fantasy has some important psychological functions. Storytelling in general does, but I love how fantasy's liberation of the imagination can aid that process in some unique ways. So I think fantasy is great for that, and that is really, to me, one of the primary functions of literature is to offer catharsis, to give us a sense of some patterns that we can impose on what is often feels like a very chaotic and meaningless world. So yeah, and fantasy is a genre that does embrace its tropes as well, for the most part. You definitely have authors who are trying to subvert those tropes, but they're still engaging with the tropes. And I think that that's an important thing to observe about fantasy, that it is perhaps more trope focused than other genres in some ways.
Yeah,
And I like
it's
that.
archetypal. Yeah.
Archetypes. Yeah, well, I don't think of the word trope as a negative word at all. I think a trope is just a
Oh
tool.
no, I didn't want to make that. What's the word? I can't think of it at the moment. I just woke up. Okay.
Yeah, no problem. I know you didn't mean it in a disparaging way. So yeah.
Mhm.
Raf, how about you? What do you think?
I think there's a lot of things that we need to talk about when we're going through the question whether fantasy is literature, because we haven't defined what literature means, but I guess we'll do that later. I think what draws people to fantasy, there's a bunch of things, and Philip has already pointed to some of them. I think the psychic distance is an important one. I think psychic distance helps. In a way, you could also call it almost alienation, because it allows you, it allows us as readers, and as it allows authors in particular, to take topics and problems of our own world, and by sort of alienating them from our experience, from our world, into a fantasy world with dragons, stuff like that, to present the core of a, say, moral argument, or any other kind of problem or question in a way that makes it more easy or more accessible to us as readers, because we're not caught up by the connections, like the real world connections that may already ensnare us and keep us from looking at specific themes in a way. So that's the psychic distance. But I think because of fantasy being clearly in a different place, it builds that psychic distance. Another part that I think is important, not so much the tropes or archetypes or whatever you want to call it, is a level of sincerity. I recently read a book on the sociology of heavy metal by a German professor of sociology called Hartmut Rosa. And while I disagree with him on a lot of things, he points out something that he finds in the heavy metal music sphere. But I think you can apply the same to fantasy in this regard. And it might be part of the key of why those two are sometimes very closely linked, is that when we're reading fantasy, we are taking these moral dilemma, and we're taking all the high drama that comes with a lot of fantasy. We're taking that stuff seriously in a way that large parts of our mostly postmodern existence, make hard to do. Like, a lot of postmodern existence nowadays for us is tinged with irony. Ironic distance is the one tool we have to survive the fact that our world is pretty much a hellhole at this point. So fantasy is one of the few places where we as readers and as writers can let our guard down and take this stuff seriously in almost a safe place. Obviously I don't want to use the term safe place too much or safe space too much, but it is very much that we can let our guard down. We can read a fantasy novel, and when we step back from that and move out of that safe space, we come back to the tribulations of our time. During that moment, we can let that down and be sincere and be honest and be serious about the most ridiculous, so to speak, or things that are seen as minute and ridiculous in our current world. We can focus on these things and take them seriously. And I think that's one of the charms that a lot of fantasy and sci-fi to a part literature offers us, that place to be sincere about things, that sincerity, to live out that sincerity, because we have a need of sincerity as humans, I think, and fantasy offers that.
Yeah, that's well said, Raf. And I think one of the great writers of the genre who has expressed similar ideas and I know you're familiar with the essays as well, Stephen Donaldson's essays on epic fantasy, where he talks about fantasy as the literature of reintegration, which is essentially what you were talking about, the idea that we can feel a sense of meaning as a result of engaging with the fantasy tale, that we have a sense of purpose, and that it is uplifting. And it's true that a lot of modern literature emphasizes the absurd, the meaninglessness of existence. And one type of fantasy, at least, that I think that Donaldson correctly identifies as epic fantasy, allows us to feel, at least while we're engaging with that tale, and maybe a little bit afterwards, that we have purpose and meaning, and that it's empowering. So I like that a lot.
Yeah, I think that's interesting there with the epic fantasy. It's sort of like the criticism that some people bring towards the more grimdark end of fantasy, because that's sort of where that irony kind of creeps back in.
Exactly.
And on the other hand, one author that I need to mention here is Terry Pratchett, because Discworld is, on the surface, a very humorous thing, and it pokes fun at just about everything. But when you read a lot of Discworld, the core of Terry Pratchett's writing is incredibly sincere. there's a sincere backbone, ethical and moral backbone to what he writes, and I think that's what keeps these books, or makes Discworld sort of this bridge almost between the fantasy genre as a whole, and makes it more accessible to people that maybe are not able to let their guard down completely with epic fantasy, which may explain why, say, Discworld has been so vastly more successful than so many other authors, because it does allow us to be ironic, but still have that, the idea that, being good matters and being evil is actually evil. And sometimes it's very clear to discern the difference. And I think that's something that I just wanted to mention, because it does combine the irony, the distance, and still lets that backbone, that sincerity show through at the points where it matters. Because dismissing irony would be wrong. I like irony in a lot of cases.
Yeah. But Discworld is not absurdist, though, because of that sincerity.
It can be very absurdist in some parts, right? I mean, especially the early novels are highly absurdist, almost surrealist.
Isn't there one where the people think like this small turtle is a god or something? I don't remember.
The turtle is a god. It's small gods, and the turtle is definitely a god. It's the great god
foundation of the world, isn't it? Yeah.
That's a different turtle. That's the turtle that moves.
I guess for my answer, I'll just speak for myself, if that's all right.
Yeah.
I don't have nearly the experience that you two guys have. But I like seeing other worlds, because I like being transported to other worlds, because well, I mean, that's the same reason I like history. It's a type of world that is somehow not quite our own, but at the same time it very much is still our own world. I think fantasy attains that, well, at its best anyway. I know there's a lot of bad stuff out there, but I think it connects us. I think the best fantasy, like the best myth, I think it connects us to our world. I don't really know what.
I think there's a difference we need to kind of sort out between myth and fantasy, because it's one of my pet peeves, so to speak. It's like that people always go like, fantasy has always been around. Look at the Greek myths. That's been fantasy. No, it's not. Myth does something that fantasy does not necessarily do, and we can argue on why that is the case. But myth is a form of storytelling that tries to make sense of the world and tries to explain the workings of the universe. And it may also explain, and tries also to explain, the role of the human condition within the workings of the universe. Fantasy literature, or literature in general, does not aspire to explaining the workings of the universe or the world. It's more focused on the human condition. And the problem is, of course, that reducing myth and fantasy just to having, dragons and unicorns and stuff ignores that important difference, that difference in category, I think. And so we need to be careful about that. But fantasy can reach closer to that by, aspiring or taking on the trappings of myth sometimes to make these things more, make them more clear as more archetypal, I guess, is the term.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Raf. I also believe that it's important to point out that myth is a kind of collective property, whereas fantasy, as a modern genre, is an individual's, in most cases, an individual's vision, which can be inspired by myth. And
of course.
Can imitate myth, but it is not in the same sense a collective. So that is, I think, an important distinction. And with myth, I think to some degree you could say that I think sometimes we underestimate ancient peoples, and to say that they believed literally in their myths would be a mistake.
Of course.
But that on some level there might be, you could assert that myths were an important part as a collective property, an important part of their cultural outlook, let's say. I
Yeah,
don't think any fantasy could claim that kind of status. So that's an important difference.
yeah. I think it's very easy when you look at, say, the difference between, let's take old text. When you look at the Golden Ass or the Satyricon and compare them to the Iliad or the Odyssey or any other of these myths, there's a categorical difference between those two. And
Yeah.
the Golden Ass and, of course, the Satyricon, they are fiction. They are fantastic fiction. The Satyricon does have one of the first, if not the first, werewolf story in it, but it's clearly made up to entertain. And I think it kind of shows that difference between, say, mythology or myth on the one hand, the idea of making myth on the one hand, versus the idea of writing fantasy or fiction on the other hand.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess.
Also, go read the Satyricon. It's really funny.
Yeah, maybe someday. Yeah, I love the other
Also,
day I was on a stream and Raph was like bringing up some stuff and I was like, man, you bring up some really obscure stuff I've never even heard of. But it's all.
the Satyricon is also not safe for work. I should probably say that it's.
Be sure not to read it while I'm at my school. So I guess the next question I have here is gonna be this might be a little bit of a tricky one because I'm gonna have to pull out that old word subjective out of the hat a little bit. But kind of carrying off what Raph was asking earlier, what he brought up earlier is what would you define as literature per se? Like when I'll let Raph go first now because fair is fair.
I am very fair.
Uh-huh.
Now, so literature, I think, so there's several aspects to the term literature and the way we use it. If you look back at when it starts to become a thing, that's actually a book that I read a while ago about the modern making or remaking or reinvention. I need to look up the title. Modern reconstruction of myth, I think, is the term, or modern construction of myth. And it looks at the 19th century, early 19th century, late 18th century in Germany, which is the Romantic movement, with a bunch of slightly known authors like Schiller and Goethe and whatnot. And the interesting part there is that that's where the term literature gets used, or the German version, which is Literatur, but it's Latin anyway. What these people do is they define literature in a way as writing fiction that includes literary criticism, or includes criticism of the form in the text and writing. So it's a very specific way of writing books and writing fiction, so to speak, that is fundamentally different from, say, the Gothic novel or the picaresque novel that you have in, say, the 17th or 18th century. In that it includes that philosophical debate of the form in itself. And that's kind of where the term literatur becomes more of a thing. And I think that's sort of where we also see the foundation of that weird distinction between capital L literature, which is seen as sort of highbrow, smart, whatever, versus general fiction, which is nowadays genre fiction, which is not as smart and so forth. Because once you do that, and the people that are part of those circles of literature in especially Germany at the time are obviously part of the elites. They're part of the academic elites at the time, and I think that's sort of where you see one of the foundation stones of making that difference between literature, which is used as a form of class distinction in a Bourdieu sense, right? Versus what the masses read. And that only gets more emphasized over time. And especially starts with, say, the 20th century, when reading becomes even more of a everyday thing. When you go and read, say, the artwork in its Age of Mechanical Reproduction by Walter Benjamin, he mentions on the side that the 20th century is the point where everyone becomes an author and a writer, because writing is so fundamentally linked to all the jobs we do in a way that it hasn't been before, which also means that reading has become so much a part
So I
of
imagine
everyone's
literacy
job.
was better at that time.
It's not so much the idea of literacy, but it's the fact that reading and writing become integrated all the jobs, even like mechanical jobs, are suddenly you need to be able to read to work machines because they come with, you know,
The manuals.
signs and stuff. You need to be able to do these things. So reading and writing become that. And that means that at the same time, reading and writing become something that people do on their own. And that's when people start reading, mass. It starts in the 19th century, right? That's when people start reading for fun and reading for entertainment. And that's where that distinction between what, doing art in a way, and doing entertainment, where that split becomes more visible, and is then, of course, used by society to, well, to build class distinction. And we're still wrangling with that nowadays, I think.
Philip, you're a professor, so what do you think about this?
I think Raph brought up some interesting points there. When I think of
As he does.
story, he usually does, yes. So the idea that there might be a distinction between storytelling and literature, and it's no accident that we're using Anglo-Saxon here when we say storytelling, and the Latin literature, which tends to sound a little more highfalutin, and there is a class distinction that Raph brought up in there. But it's the idea of that he brought up of self-awareness in storytelling, and that somehow creating a distinction, I think is an interesting one. And you mentioned the late 18th, early 19th century as a time period when you really see that happening. I can think of some earlier texts where you can see that, for example, in the 14th century, in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a wonderful, very ironic and humorous examination of chivalric Arthurian tales.
Yeah, of course.
Very, very self-aware. Chaucer is another great example of somebody.
Don Quixote in Spanish as well, right?
Don Quixote, exactly. So
yeah,
you can see examples of that sort of thing in even earlier periods.
Yeah.
But I do think that this is an interesting point, and it might be the case that you do need a certain level of literacy. In other words, when we go from the earlier Middle Ages to the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance, what you're seeing is a gradual transition between what was fundamentally oral formulaic storytelling to a more, let's say, letter-based written form of storytelling. And I think that kind of self-awareness, that sort of meta level of examining what are we doing here with this storytelling, and that being an aspect of literature is something that does result from it being in a written form rather than in an oral form over time. And that's something that takes centuries to really take hold. So I think that's an interesting distinction that, and you can read a lot about. There's some great body of literature about the transition from oral culture to literature to a literate culture. And some people think that we've now entered a period of secondary literacy. So it's kind of fascinating to see how storytelling evolves in that way.
Cynics may even call it post-literacy.
Yes, indeed.
But I think you're right, and I think there's an important aspect there that we sometimes ignore, especially in like a more broader understanding or almost cynical understanding of history. But like literary levels rose markedly in the 15th century, right? We have like Gutenberg and his gang doing their inventing print in like the 1450s, and one of the reasons why, say, the Arthurian myth is so popular is that Mallory got his book printed in 1480 something, and that's one of the reasons why that version of Arthur became so incredibly popular. Or when you look at, say, the early 16th century, the dissemination of broadsheets with, both images on them and some really interesting woodcuts are there to be found, and stories. Public literacy starts becoming a main thing in the late 15th and early 16th century. We often ignore them. It's like, well, that's basically still the Middle Ages and no one could read, right? And I'm like, no, that's not true. My point that I wanted to bring up with that distinction with literature in the 19th century is more about that the term literatur or literature enters the discourse at that point from an elitist perspective. Obviously, you have metafictional stuff going on way before that. It's just that's sort of where that starts entering the discourse as a term.
And I do wonder if it's no accident that we're talking about essentially the time of the Industrial Revolution.
Oh yeah, we do.
Yeah. So that probably has a lot to do, again, with the as you brought up, I think very rightly, the invention of the printing press did make books more widely available, and that's very important. The Industrial Revolution made books a lot cheaper, and again made them more widely available. And we're now in a time when the internet has made things even more widely available, and it'll be interesting to see the repercussions
for better
of
or
that.
for worse.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting that that idea of literature in that German sense is very much tied to the German Romantic movement, which obviously had a huge impact on the idea of how to do arts and how to do stuff, and fantasy literature in particular, throughout the 19th century, with the movement to to England, to people like George MacDonald, and all the way to the 20th century, and people like Tolkien. And so we see that idea that there are some texts that are more serious and should be taken more seriously than others. That idea, I think, comes sort of from there. It's always been around, because class distinctions is something we've done probably ever since we came up with the idea of dividing labor, right? But it becomes sort of codified in a lot of ways over the last 200 years, I guess, sort of.
Yeah, I agree, and we're talking about a very important time period here with the Industrial Revolution. And the Romantic movement as a reaction in many ways against the Industrial Revolution, against capitalism. And
but it was always elitist at its time, right?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I mean, look, a big aspect of Romanticism within the 19th century is, look at this terrible time we're in. People are treated like garbage. They work in these factories. They die. What about the old days, the Middle Ages, when everything was beautiful and people had a place in society and they took care of each other, and there was all this idealizing of this of ancient days and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you see that that is a very important part of the roots of fantasy as a genre, really in the 19th century, with writers like William Morris, and then later Tolkien was a major inheritor of this notion that things were really better in the more rural, agrarian Middle Ages, as opposed to the exploitative, industrial later times. So it's a huge part of fantasy as a social critique, actually. Is its roots in Romanticism, and then later in the Neo-Gothic movement of the Victorian period. So it's an important part of fantasy, as we talked about in the beginning, as a form of social critique, but also as a way to escape from the ugliness of the present.
Yeah. And I think that's sort of where we could move forward to the question of, like, why is fantasy not seen as part of literature today? Because obviously it isn't, for all kinds of reasons, and there's social reasons why people that are part of, say, the literary elite feel the need to sort of build a wagon fort and keep everyone away, because their respect and status is definitely dwindling. But I think what's interesting is that double-pronged approach, or double-pronged way fantasy developed or the fantastic developed in the 20th century, because you have two sides of that. You have the Tolkien people that follow in the tradition of the Romantic. Tolkien and others follow that, William Morris, George MacDonald kind of way. On the one hand, the Romantics, and you have the American way, so to speak,
Conan,
the pulps, the Conan, the Robert E. Howards, the Clark Ashton Smiths, those people that are, by definition, because those are published in the pulps and entertained, they are always seen as lesser in that regard. And so what we see is that on the one hand, we have something that is always cast down as, from a classist perspective, as entertainment for the masses, mass culture, so to use the terminology of Adorno, right? But on the other hand, we have Tolkien and those people who are in a Lutheran term, Schwärmer, the people that are building castles in the air, that are letting their emotions take over, and are thus also abandoning the idea that our society needs realists and hard-headed realists that have common sense and accept the realities of our world. And Tolkien and that tradition is sort of floating above it. So you have an idea, or like a narrative, an elitist narrative for what is called capital literature, capital L literature at the time, that kind of reclamates for itself to be the only form of written art, so to speak, to interpret and mediate the world. And, the one form of fantasy is below that because it's just cheap entertainment for the masses. And the other one is above that because it refuses to accept the realities of the world. And that's sort of how fantasy got pushed out of literature, so to speak. I think that's the narrative I would tell if I would ever have to tell the history of fantasy.
I mean, you two bring up interesting points, and that kind of brings up something I find interesting, not just about fantasy in general, but literature books, or I've sort of flirted with this conversation before, but I like to view. But I've heard people describe literature almost like a conversation, that these authors are, and you brought this up a little bit with the Romantics, that they were responding to what they were seeing, as all great
that's what
authors
art
do.
always does.
And I find that interesting how authors, whether it be in the fantasy genre or in the, I think fantasy is similar, because we all have the people who we're inspired by, and we make our own version of it. Be like, wait a minute, wouldn't it be like this? But I guess that brings me to my next question here, which is, would you consider fantasy to be a genre that's worthy of being called literature?
What I think I would like to say about that is that there are many types of storytelling, and sometimes we call them genres, and I'm not going to quibble about that. But the fact of the matter is, you can find storytelling that is theme driven and deep and vast within any genre, and I don't really care which one you care to talk about. It's just, and then there are stories that exist to entertain, and there's very little thought that goes into them in terms of what are the themes. I'm not saying they're void of themes either, by the way. I don't know if you can tell a story that is void of theme, but you can certainly, an author can begin with theme, or can write a tale that is theme driven, or can make a serious effort to incorporate theme into the story. And that tends to be one of the things we say, aha, this is literature. Whereas the stuff that is more entertaining, some people look down on. So I think within, I'm sure you could find horror fiction or science fiction or romance or whatever, the things that usually tend to get relegated into, and this is sometimes said in a pejorative way, genre fiction, right? As opposed to literature,
which has no genre whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a silly thing, honestly. But I think my main point is just this, that you can find great storytelling within any type of genre, if you want to call it that. And you can find examples of storytelling that is just fluff and entertaining. And I think that's probably a good thing, because people need that sometimes. As our good friend AP Canavan would say, sometimes you want a hamburger and sometimes you want a 7-course meal, and there's nothing wrong with either one, depending on what you're reaching for in the moment.
Sometimes we like being told a good story, as I think Raffi said that at one point.
Yeah, I think what you brought up, Philip, is really interesting, because even by the way you try to talk about it, we learned that how words have meaning. Some have vast and deep meaning and stuff. Mm-hmm. And those are words that already have a very positive and, you might say, elitist connotation. It's sometimes I just want to have a story. And like,
Yeah.
why are we using just in that situation, right? But it's like we already sort of pushing it down. We're already kind of classifying it as lesser than the deep and vast meaning. And I think that's one of those really interesting questions that we rarely tackle. Is like, why do you think one of them is better than the other? And the way we've built our language, or the way we've um, sort of loaded our language with meaning and associated meanings and connotations over the last couple of centuries, kind of makes it very difficult to even move out of that conversation and move towards a more neutral ground, because languages can never be neutral, right?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, I agree with you, Philip. I think that there's all sorts of great storytelling in whatever literature might be out there. I mean, I would say something like American Gods is just as beautiful and profound as something like I don't know. Uh, I'll go with Cormac McCarthy because he's one of my favorite authors, but The Road, you know.
And that's like an interesting question, because you brought up the road, right? It's an interesting point. The road is a post-apocalyptic
Well, yeah.
you can call that sci-fi. You can call that sci-fi and genre fiction, but we
Yeah.
don't. So the question is like, why don't we call it sci-fi and genre fiction? Why do we call it capital L literature? At that point, it's just because there's institutions that sort of gatekeep what is considered the one and what's considered the other. And those are like his publishers that decide, that market to a specific crowd. It's the people that back in the day when we still had, journals and newspapers and whatnot, you have those people that write literary criticism versus just booktube people. And that's why Cormac McCarthy is considered literature, even when he writes something about man-eating cannibals in the future, versus Mad Max being
Well,
considered trash.
I didn't want to say Blood Meridian because, like, I don't know if beautiful is one of the things I would call that, but is one of the
Yeah.
words I
No,
would
but
use for
I
that.
think
But
it's important to understand that while we may have started out with very specific forms of literature, um, these forms have sort of transcended, and now it's more a institutional judgment,
mm,
and not so much the fantasy. And which brings us back to that that old essay, old by now essay of Salman Rushdie that both
Yeah.
Philip and I talked about, right? When he comments on what is fantasy, which he calls trash, and what is magical realism, which he considers to be worthwhile. And for some reason, the Hunger Games are trash and Harry Potter is not. And I'm like, how are you? Is because one of them is written by a British author and one of them is written by an American author, and you have a very specific cultural bias. Like, how are you actually judging those things? Because if you take away the trappings of a genre, it's like, how do you judge what has merit and what has not?
Right.
And it's
And
one of the questions that we don't have any answer for that, really.
yeah, and he's not the only author either, Salman Rushdie, who has tried to say, no, 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 no. What I'm doing is serious fiction. It is magic realism, not fantasy.
like, what does magical
And
realism even mean? I don't mean to interrupt you, Philip, but like that term kind of bugs
yeah,
me a little bit. It's still
well,
fantastical. Yeah.
the way I think of it is
It's a
where
school of writing.
it's a school of writing, and it's prominent in South America, but also in South Asia and certain parts of the world. You can find authors who write in this vein, but essentially it's where you have a story that is fundamentally in our world, but the element of the fantastic somehow or other enters into it without any attempt to explain it, and that's kind of, for me, the essence of magic realism. But I do think that I think of it as a subgenre, if you will, of fantasy, and that I feel, as someone who admires Salman Rushdie's writing,
Some
I
of it.
find it, some of it. I do feel it's unfortunate that he and others, he's not the only one, have gone along with the Raf mentioned publishers and others with vested interests who want to make this distinction that this is serious literature and this stuff over here is not. And there's no one who can just draw a line and say, here on this side you have magic realism, and on this side it's fantasy, and this is serious and this is fluff. Nobody can do that, and there are certain lots of great books that straddle that. Really, you brought up American Gods. I think that's a great example of a
Well, it
book
was the
that
first one that I mean, it is my favorite fantasy novel, at least so far.
uh
Anyway, it could change in the
Yeah.
future, but it's one that now best of all time. I won't go there, but it's my personal favorite so far, and I thought
Oh,
that
I think it's
Yeah.
great. It's a great book.
It's a good novel. I think part of that is like genre. Like on the one hand, we need to question why we are looking for some, because a lot of this, like, is this literature, is this fantasy stuff, is us as readers desperately wanting some form of external validation of our enjoyment in a lot of ways. And I think that's part of what comes back with people like Salman Rushdie and, other authors of that sort, is that weird idea that if their stuff is considered, you know, um, fantasy and not something else, they're sort of, they see a lessening of their social standing in a lot of ways, and I think that's the social component of it that is important to understand. That's where all the mechanisms come in. On the other hand, when it comes to magical realism, of course, the term comes from German, from magischer Realismus, and that's like, I would say it's a school, and a lot of times we kind of confuse genre and school. The same like way is that, isn't it weird, a genre or is it a school? Is pulp a genre or is it a school? And I think oftentimes it's what I would call a school or a tradition, because it's a group of authors actually communicating with each other, which is why you have so much magical realism happening in Latin America, because they're connected by language, they're connected by probably writing to each other, talking to each other, having exchanges of opinions outside of the books they're writing. The same with the pulp school, right? Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, Fritz Lieber, sometimes Jack Vance, H.P. Lovecraft. Those people wrote letters to each other. They conversed around it. They sort of had an ongoing thing. That's how these very specific forms of the fantastic are built, of the forms of like any form of writing. That's how a school of art always develops. Like people having the same kind of impressions or similar impressions of the world and channeling them in a similar way, and then they're kindred spirits. They communicate with each other. And then starting to elevate one over the other is, well, that's the mechanisms of, I hate to say it, but it's capitalism at the end of the day.
Well, that's a good point, and that kind of brings me to kind of my next question here, which is kind of what inspired me to do this conversation here today, because this is something that kind of, it's weird. It frustrates me, but it also kind of fascinates me, because like it just makes me wonder, like just about the labels we put on each other. But I'll stop stalling. Do you think there is a double standard with fantasy literature and academia? Like, or if so, why do you think this is the case? And Philip, you work in academia, so I'll let you go first.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'd point out too that Raf has a lot of experience
Oh
in
yeah,
academia
sorry,
too,
Raph. I
as
forgot
But
a,
not
about
a
in
you.
PhD.
not in literature, so it is absolutely valid to have. Philip knows what he's talking about. I just pretend.
Which is not true, but anyway,
I'm
I
like,
can't
oh yeah,
say
he
that.
also has been in academia. Whoops.
If I did philosophy and history, that's not the same as literature, so
Okay.
definitely I can't judge there.
Okay.
But I think that you're right, Britain, that historically and even until today, there is a bit of snobbery in academia.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because we were just talking about Salman Rushdie and others trying to be perceived as serious literature. And I think that's linked to this question. It's also the fact that as much as I think that was a correct distinction that Raf made earlier, very correct, between the more let's say Tolkien related or inspired type of fantasy versus the pulp fantasy, where the pulp fantasy is seen as being somehow lesser. But from a the elitist perspective, it's all thrown in the same bin, really.
Mm-hmm.
Tolkien, everything is childish and silly and escapist, and that word to me is not necessarily a bad word, which Tolkien himself has pointed out. that sometimes it is actually a healthy thing to escape. And you have to ask the question, what are you escaping from? Is what Tolkien says, I think, very cleverly. But yes, there has been a lot of snobbery. That said, I think it's also fair to say that in the last few decades, you can find more and more people taking genre fiction, popular culture. There are even, disciplines nowadays like cultural studies, that will look at more popular forms of literature, the less elitist storytelling, let's say, and make a serious study of it. And so, I mentioned AP earlier. He has a PhD in fantasy literature. You can do that now.
That's a flex.
Yeah, absolutely. I
I
think
was
it's
about to say
fantastic.
like you and AP and Raph.
Yeah. Yeah,
Jordan.
AP really knows what he's talking about when he's talking about fantasy, and he's studied it, at a very formal level. And you can do that, and that to me is a good sign that more and more there's recognition. It's not anywhere close to universal yet, but more and more, I think we're seeing recognition that of what fantasy offers, that it is worthy of critical exploration, as any other form of storytelling is.
Yeah, I guess it kind of, I mentioned this when we had our podcast episode, Philip, but I guess it kind of interests me that, like, I don't know, like, why is, Kurt Vonnegut considered literature, and why is Tolkien,
Or Ursula Le Guin,
yeah.
Well, mostly because they're actually really, really good, and
they're great.
R.A. Salvatore are not.
I don't want to take away from. I haven't actually read Le Guin yet, so I didn't want to.
That was a value judgment, but I have to agree with you, Raph.
But I have read Slaughterhouse-Five. It is a fantastic novel.
I think there's a bunch of reasons here, and I think that's sort of where I have to get somewhat political. See, the problem is when we're talking about literature in academia, we're part of the humanities, and the humanities have not had a good time over the last, say, 60, 70 years, to put it mildly.
And it's worse
under neoliberalism in the last 50, 60, 70 years, the humanities have suffered, which means, with a focus on STEM and science, and the roots for that go far further back, all the way to Francis Bacon, if you will. But the point is, if you're in academia, in the humanities, you're constantly threatened by further budget cuts and so forth. And you need to justify every single thing you do. And because of how society works and how everything works at the end of the day is, if you need to justify these things and need to justify your spending, you need to justify that stuff to very conservative people, because people that end up in charge of the money are usually conservative because, they're older and so forth. And
well, let's say that they're more corporate minded anyway.
Corporate minded, but also just by being older, you get more conservative. That's just part of it, and that means that a lot of times it's very difficult to justify talking about fantasy, science fiction, and so forth. If for the last 200 years we've talked about the same sort of Western canon, it's like, well, I can only afford 2 professors because that's all the budget cuts allow me, and one of them is talking about Shakespeare, and one of them is talking about the great American novel of the 19th and 20th century. And I need to fire one of them to actually have someone who will talk about Tolkien and Ursula Le Guin. It's like, you cannot justify that to the people that actually hold the money bag. And that's part of why these genre differences, or the sort of denigration of the fantastic has this weird root, deeply ingrained sort of root going on, and that's part of the problem. I think that we need to acknowledge is we're not sexy enough for the people that allow to have 1 or 2 professors of literature at a university to spend money on us, because at the end of the day, Shakespeare and maybe James Joyce are the ones that get the money, to put it mildly. And I think it's unfortunate, but it's a reality that we have to live with. We could try to change that reality, but that's a different story, I guess.
Yeah, no, I guess I find it kind of fascinating because, again, because it's about the boxes we kind of make for ourselves, and
yeah,
excuse me, Yeah, we're all coughing today. But yeah, I think you have a point there, Raph. You have talking about that fantasy is, genre fiction sometimes isn't sexy for a lot of people. But I just
Unless you read Fourth Wing.
oh god.
Really, the word, I think, by sexy, what we mean is lucrative.
Yes.
Yeah, lucrative or has enough prestige. Prestigious might be the more important word there because we're talking about people we know. Old people with money are prestigious and not lucrative.
I mean, I I guess what I think is I mean I think like Lord of the Rings is just as beautiful as something like again, I don't know, The Great Gatsby, for instance, because I like The Great
Yeah,
Gatsby a lot.
By the
that's
way, I think this is a flawed mindset as well. If you're looking at it from strictly just economic terms,
Oh,
most
I hope I
employers.
wasn't.
No, not you. I'm
Oh,
not talking
oh,
about you, Britton. I'm just talking about that general assumption
yeah.
that somehow fantasy, literature, humanities, you name it, is not going to make money for an institution.
Yeah, that's wrong and stupid. I know
It's
that.
wrong. It's actually really wrong because what do most employers say they want? They want people who can think critically. They want people who can approach problems and issues in a way that might not be the normal way. So a lot of times employers might prefer an English major over, let's say, a business major. Because the English major is more likely to have been encouraged to think critically over the years, and so there is value to the humanities that you can't necessarily put an exact monetary
Yeah,
amount on.
and that's kind of the problem that I alluded to, right? Is that it's not quantifiable, and we live in a time and place and a society where quantifiability, whatever the word is absolute king. That's what
Data,
people like.
data. Yes.
What people like Adorno and Horkheimer would call instrumental reason, and the results of instrumental reason, and thus one of the darker results of Francis Bacon's style Enlightenment. And I think that's part of it. But when you brought up Tolkien compared to Great Gatsby, I think there's an interesting point because Tolkien studies are a thing now. And the question is, like, how much is that because Tolkien's writings are objectively superior to other fantasy? And how much of that is because Tolkien, as a professor, already brought a certain amount of prestige to the table? And if you're an academic and you're talking about fantasy and orcs and elves, you'd rather talk about a fellow professor, a fellow academic, than talking about some dude who, not to put too fine a point on him, shot himself age 30 in Texas.
oh.
Yeah. Well, that is an evolution though, because Tolkien himself really made a distinction in his own time, between his hobby, his creative writing, and his academic work. And
Oh
it
yeah,
was something
Tolkien would
kept.
not agree, but I think current
Yeah.
academia does sort of fall into that trap.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, no, I think yeah, it's kind of interesting, which it kind of brings me to another topic of discussion. Do you think fantasy has changed in the mod? Do you think like the conversation or even just the genre in general has changed? Now, I would say yes. I think fantasy's become more diverse. I mean, there's definitely still a ways to go, but there's definitely a lot more than just Lord of the Rings copies, which there's good Lord of the Rings inspired stuff, but
Sure.
I think fantasy has grown more diverse, and I do think that we're starting to get more comfortable with fantasy as a genre. I don't know what you guys think about that. Maybe I'm on something. I don't know.
I think
I'll let
so.
Philip go
I would agree. I
Also,
would agree with.
indie is blown up ridiculously, so that's probably also helped
Yep.
matters. At least on our side of the internet, it has.
Yeah, no, that's true. That is part of the increased diversification of fantasy as well. The viability of indie and self-published books, no doubt about it. And I agree with you about the increased diversity as being one of the most important and promising trends in the genre. I think it's wonderful. I think we might be able to look back on this time as a kind of golden age in terms of the genre and pushing the boundaries and seeing what can be done. And I think it's an important development, that a vital development, in fact, that we have a lot more different voices involved. And at least, I mean, these voices were always around. The issue was that they weren't given a chance to get the prestige of having a traditional publisher put their work out, you know. And that has changed for the good. And so, yeah, I think it is very enriching for all of us to have the increased diversity, and it's exciting to me, really exciting, all the possibilities out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that I think people are becoming more like I said, I think people are becoming more comfortable with fantasy. You know, we're seeing
Mhm.
like highbrow writers like Marlon James do stuff like Black Leopard, Red Wolf, which I think is a fantastic and very underrated, or at least on our side of the internet, it's underrated. I know it got a bunch of awards. Um, you know, and we also see people who skirt the line, like Neil Gaiman and
Michael Chabon.
Michael Chabon. Thank you. Um, China Mieville to another extent. You know, other people I could mention. Raph, you were gonna say something?
I want to agree with Philip on the general thing. I would want to give it like a different spin. I think fantasy has always been much larger. I think it's our attention has changed, and partly that's because of self-publishing, partly that's of society changing. But when you look back, we've had really interesting, unique things outside of the Tolkien sphere. From
Mhm.
whenever people were writing fantasy, and some of them slipped through, you know, the weird process of gatekeeping that publishing had. We have stuff like, say, Blood in the Mist by Hope Merleys, which is a female fantasy writer in 1920 something, 22, 23.
Mhm.
We have David Lindsay writing A Voyage to Arcturus, which is one of the weirdest things I've ever read. We have, no, seriously, we have people like Angela Carter writing feminist fairy tale retellings and becoming a huge deal. No one talks about them that much. We have people like, you know, Octavia Butler writing her stuff. We have people like Peter S. Beagle writing a magical, because I have to talk about it because I just read it for the first time, A Fine Private Place. It's debut novel in 1960, which is a ghost love story in New York on a cemetery. And it's brilliant. It's all this stuff has always been there, but for all kinds of reasons, we have, as an audience, narrowed down our perspective of fantasy for a long time. And what the internet has done and what social media has done is break that open again. And yes, most of the people I just mentioned were still white, but obviously we've turned the stuff more international now and more inclusive now. But we have, the stuff has always been there. We have oftentimes closed our eyes to a lot of the stuff that has been there, because we followed a very specific form of narrative of like what fantasy was like. And I think it's important to make that difference between, yes, the real marginalization of already marginalized groups on the one hand, and on the other hand, the more proactive marginalization that we as an audience did to ourselves when we sort of focused on one specific big story of how fantasy worked for a long time.
Yeah, no, I would agree. You know, I mean, I always try to expand my horizons. I don't know if I do a great job at it, but I think it's the thought that counts.
I, I think it's interesting that like when you listen to a lot of people and they talk about like how fantasy was this, basically there was nothing, then there was maybe Conan if we remember him, then there was Tolkien, and there was Tolkien all the way to like the 1990s, and then we discovered grimdark. And and that's like sort of like the mainstream narrative of how fantasy worked. It's like George R. Martin freed fantasy from us being, you know, everything being just called Tolkien clones. And
Right.
that's ridiculous, because if you go and, you know, start reading stuff that was published in the 50s and 60s, your Roger Zelazny's, your Peter S. Beagles, all of these people were writing incredibly creative stuff that was totally outside of that mainstream narrative. But
Yeah.
it's one of the things that we're slowly learning that we need to be sort of doing. But on the one hand, I think as fantasy readers and sort of creators, content creators at least, right, what we need to do is, on the one hand, make sure that new and upcoming voices get their space in the spotlight, but also kind of gives some restorative justice to the authors that were pushed to the wayside back in the past. And I think that's sort of like one of the responsibilities I see for myself as a booktuber, is like to make sure people recognize that this stuff has always been there, and we should probably, I don't want to say honor the ones that we've kind of ignored for long, but go and look at the beauty that has always been there. And I think what you said, like what Philip said, like we have become so much, it has moved so much. And I think the keystone for me, it's why I would always say that N.K. Jemisin is one of the most important authors of the 21st century. Is like the 3 consecutive wins of Hugo Awards for The Broken Earth are a watershed in that regard. And no matter what you like about the books, that's when suddenly mainstream fantasy, or at least active fantasy, rediscovered the idea of writers of color.
Mm-hmm.
And I said rediscover because, of course, we had people like Octavia Butler and so forth before that. But it's sort of when we kind of recognized that and honored that in a public manner, and it's a watershed in that regard. And I think we should move forward from there and take that momentum and look at all the beauty that we have out there.
Yeah, most definitely. I think that there. I mean, like I said, I think there's still a place to go, but I think we're in the right direction, at least.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Well, I have one more question here. It's more of a personal question to you guys, if you don't mind indulging me a little more here. But what books have you read that made you consider that fantasy can be just as great as any other piece of literature, if that makes sense?
Sure. I think Raph and I are probably going to agree about a few of these. One series is the Malazan Book of the Fallen.
I had a feeling you guys would bring that up.
The greater Malazan universe. I just finished The Realm of the Elderlings. That's another one. I'm reading Jenny Wirtz's Wars of Light and Shadow. That's another one. Susanna Clarke has written for me in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, but also in her more recent work, Piranesi. There's another one. I mean, we could go on and on. There's Guy Gavriel Kay. There are lots of just great authors out there who are writing great literature that happens to be fantasy. Mm-hmm. That's my take. But yeah, we could make a list. I'm sure Raph could name a lot as well. I'm focusing on people who are around right now, but we could go back in time and there are lots of others. N.K. Jemisin is one that Raph just mentioned. I love the Broken Earth trilogy. I think that's a great one. Great example of literature that challenges us, that has some brilliant social critique, and it's just a great story, doing some really cool experimental things in there. So yeah, I mean, geez, I could look back at my shelves. I
was getting a little distracted by your shelf there for a minute.
Yeah, I mean, I read, for me, the Josiah Bancroft's Books of Babel was a great series in that regard. Mark Lawrence is the book that wouldn't burn. I think I would put in there as well. A recent book. We could go on and on and on, but yeah, so many, and the genre is of course, Lord of the Rings for me. That's not just as I said earlier. I think there are some interesting social critiques in Lord of the Rings as well, but yeah, there's a long list. Raph, what would you add to all that?
Yeah, you have some,
I think
you have some out there ones.
There's a bunch of things. The important part is, I think, what literature in general, what fiction can do, what art can do, is like it can move us. And I think every single book ever written has that potential. Yes, even the Dark Elf stories by R.A. Salvatore. Even those, no, that's the point. We look at art and it makes us think, and it doesn't matter what makes you think, as long as it makes you think. That's good art. That's the starting. When it comes to sort of what made me think, or realize that fantasy can do way more, or fantasy and science fiction can do way more than just tell stories about orcs and dragons. I
And
would say
spaceships.
Ian MacDonald's Desolation Road, which takes the themes and tropes and the trappings of magical realism and turns them into a story on Mars, is one of the things that sort of made me realize that, yeah, the sky absolutely is the limit. Ursula Le Guin,
Oh yeah, yeah.
both Earthsea and also the Left Hand of Darkness, definitely, opened up further horizons to me in a lot of ways. Roger Zelazny, the Books of Amber, very much like how you can, I like books that push the limit in a lot of ways that, sort of break down boundaries. Michael Chabon, both the Yiddish Policeman's Union and A Gentleman of the Road, wonderful Fafhrd and Grey Mouse's story set in like 9th century Black Sea adjacent Kaganate of the Jewish Kaganate there, Khazars, that's the word I was looking for. Stuff like that. People like Cameron Hurley bringing all their anger to fantasy, to just go and move the world because the world sucks for them. Stuff like that. And definitely last year, and I have to mention, definitely Nicola Griffith doing the things she did with Spear for Arthurian Legends, and the things she did for historical fiction with both Hild and Meanwood. That's sort of where you can see, like, there is no distinction between literature and fantasy or genre, whatever. There's techniques, and we can use those techniques for whatever we're doing. And as long as it moves you, it's a good book. That's where I stand.
Yeah, it's a good
Agreed.
point. I mean, mine would probably be American Gods. I love that book a
Yeah.
lot. Um, Going a little further, this is a comic, but the Sandman from Neil Gaiman, I think
Mhm. Yeah.
I think is wonderful. Um, um, and I mean, if you like American Gods, I think you'll like the Sandman. Of course, Black Leopard, Red Wolf, like I mentioned earlier, I think is a really great book.
I'm
And
going to read it very soon. I just need to wait for the third book to be out, but I've read all the other books that Marlon James has written.
Cool.
I also really dug the Vor, even if I didn't fully understand it. And Raph and I had a conversation about Hollow, which that was also really weird. China
Raph, you
Mieville's,
probably would add China Mieville too, wouldn't
yeah,
you?
I absolutely appreciate what China Mieville does, and I really like his books. But I read them at a time where I was all like, "Oh, I've read Marxist stuff. This is just
Ah,
good, right? Don't get me wrong. This is brilliant. I like it, but it's
wow.
at the end of the day, whatever pushes boundaries is going to get me, no matter what. And
Yeah.
I guess we've reached the end of our time here. But before we end, what with you mentioning Neil Gaiman all the time, let me reiterate: you need to go and read "I Find a Private Place," which has a wonderful poem reference in the title, um,
is that a Neil
by
Gaiman short
Peter.
story?
It's a Peter S. Beagle novel. It's the most Neil
Oh,
Gaiman novel that Neil Gaiman hasn't written. And
Huh.
it has an introduction by Neil Gaiman in the newest version. It's about a guy living on a cemetery, having a talking raven friend that steals sandwiches for him, and he can talk to the dead.
It does sound like Neil
yeah,
Gaiman.
that
Yeah.
sounds
Yeah,
gamey.
it's 19-year-old Peter S. Beagle. He wrote it before he wrote The Last Unicorn. It's
Hmm.
magical. It's wonderful. It shows all the possibilities that the Fantastic had in 1958 to 1960, and yeah, the love, the focus on humans, on humanity, and the underlying sincerity that makes fantasy such a wonderful, such a powerful form of literature, such a powerful form of art that we can always come back to, and focus on ourselves and who we want to be and who we should be.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of wrap up some thoughts here, I think fantasy really touches that part of ourselves that think that there has to be more to this life than what we have already. Now, that might sound kind of silly to some people, more cynical folk, but I think I think fantasy really touches that part of the human experience because we all want more out of life, and I mean, you could nitpick that. I'm trying to keep things simple here at the moment, but I think that's what fantasy does best. Well, when it's on form, anyway. Yeah, again, there's there's a lot of. What do you guys think about that?
I think that's great. It's a good note to end on, I would say. And thank you so much for inviting me here. It's been a pleasure talking with you, Britton, and also with you, Raf. It's always great to hear your thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I also wanted to thank both you gentlemen for taking the time out of
Yeah.
your day.
Thank you. I better go back to my Mormon studies now.
If you want to if you want to share anything before we wrap up here, feel free. I'm not gonna.
I guess.
I think I'm good.
Subscribe to Philip's channel if you haven't, and I would be surprised if you haven't.
Well, subscribe to Raf and Britton too if you haven't. Of course, we're on Britton's channel, so you probably know about it, I would guess.
Yeah.
Again, thank you, gentlemen, for giving so much of your time. This has been a really fun conversation. I'm glad we managed to get it done because, yeah. All right. Well, I think that's
Cheers.
it for now. Until next time.
Alrighty.